I usually only shoot in RAW, but after playing with the JPEG files and the simulation built inside the Ricoh IIIx, I actually quite like it. So I took it to YouTube, I made a post and asked you guys if you guys only shooting RAW, JPEG, or both, and the majority of you answered both. That is also how I use my Ricoh now. I shoot in RAW and JPEG at the same time. So today I want to share the straight out of the camera JPEG recipes and settings I use with the Ricoh IIIx. Now obviously the same idea and settings would apply to the Ricoh IIII as well because they are essentially identical except the focal length. So let's start with the exposure mode. I almost always shoot in manual mode, and that is my preferred method of shooting on pretty much all kinds of cameras. And yes, some might say that it's slow to adjust all the settings and it's a bit of a hassle, but I actually find using manual mode much easier, especially with the Ricoh. Like once I get into an environment, I will adjust the ISO, and I wouldn't really change the ISO like all the time unless I move to a different location where the lighting and environment is different. Then I will adjust the front dial for shutter speed and the back dial for aperture. This way I can adjust them however I want by flicking the dials with just one hand. I guess I'm kind of a control freak whenever it comes to camera settings. I just want to have as much control as I can. And plus, shooting with the LCD screen allows me to see the changes almost instantaneously, where I can really retain my highlight and keep the shadow. And I'm not trying to say the highlight metering is bad or anything. It's a great tool to have, but I guess I'm just more of an old school type of guy. As for focus, I use autofocus with full press snap on the shutter button. The snap focus is fast and easy once you're really used to gauging the distance of where you want to focus. And I actually find it more reliable in backlit and low light situations. This way I don't have to rely on my camera trying to focus hunt on the subject I want to be focused on. And on top of that, I have the touch autofocus turned on to full press snap, so I can just kind of like tap on the screen to use snap focus. And I quite like that because first, it's actually a bit faster than pressing all the way down on the shutter button, and second, I can use the touch screen like snap focus, so I can use the Ricoh kind of like a phone where it's kind of stealthy, and if I turn it to portrait mode, like this is exactly like a phone now, and I just press to use snap focus. This works amazingly well on the street. People just think you're having, you're using a phone. Now let's talk about the straight out of the camera JPEG recipe that I made on the Ricoh, which is the main reason why I started shooting JPEG again, because of this. And let's start with the color one. Under image control, if you scroll all the way down, you'll see two wrenches. That's where you can customize your own settings. So inside the first one, I have positive film. And for saturation, I have it at +2. Down to hue, I have +1. No adjustment under high-low key adjustment. As for contrast, I raised it up to 3. Pull down the highlight contrast to -3. And I have +3 under shadow contrast. As for sharpness, I have a +1. No changes to shading, -1 for clarity, and that's pretty much it under image control. Obviously, if we want to have a more defined look of our straight out of the camera JPEG photo, we'll need to play around more with the composition of the white balance. Under white balance, you'll see that auto white balance is the first one that shows up. And what I do here is to go to function, where we can change the composition of the auto white balance here. Over here, we'll go to G3, and then all the way to A12. This makes the image more on the warm side of spectrum, and this is what I usually use whenever the weather is good outside under like a sunny condition. So that's more like my go-to setting when I'm shooting outdoor. Now whenever I'm shooting indoor, I use a different composition for white balance. So after auto white balance, you'll see multi-auto white balance. So over here, I'll adjust it to G3 again, and then all the way to B12 on the other end of the spectrum. And that's the setting I usually use whenever I'm shooting indoor. Keep in mind though, these are just like the general settings, and they don't work like 100% of the time. And whenever I see a photo that it's presented differently and there's something I want to change, you can always change it inside the Ricoh. All we have to do is go to raw development, and then we can change the settings all over again. And oftentimes I'll go under white balance and go to the Kelvin scale, where you can adjust the Kelvin scale individually as well as the composition for white balance. But honestly, so far I find this recipe works really well, and the color of the positive film just looks amazing. Like if I do have to do some tweaking, it's very minor, very little. I actually find myself using less raw photos, like putting into Lightroom and then edit the photo myself. All I have to do is just to use the straight out of the camera JPEG file, and it just looks amazing. As for the black and white straight out of the camera JPEG recipe, I actually had problem picking which one should I use as the base because there are so many choices. Like there's monotone, there's soft monotone, there's hard monotone, and there's also high contrast black and white. And especially the high contrast black and white filter. It reminds me a lot of Daido Moriyama's work. It just looks really good straight out of the camera. But honestly, it's way too strong for my taste, so I ended up not using the high contrast black and white. Instead, I used the regular monotone for my black and white JPEG recipe. So under the second customized page, I have monotone, and I did not touch the high and low key adjustment here. I did bump up the contrast to 2, and the highlight contrast to 4. I also pulled the shadows contrast all the way down to -4, added 2 to the sharpness, skip the toning and filter effect. Coming down to shading, I have -1 in there, +2 clarity, and last but not least, I did not add any grain effect in here. I feel like black and white photos are way undervalued nowadays, especially with all the social medias we have. Everyone seems to be really focused on the most colorful photos, images, whatever that can stimulate their eyeballs. And somehow the black and white photo just doesn't really hit the spot for most people. But I still love the simplicity of how it portrays a photo, especially for photographers who's looking for a black and white photo, because the process of looking for a black and white photo is a completely different game compared to a color photo. By using less color, but instead we now focus more on the relation between light and shadow. It's kind of like the software version of less is more, and I'm all for it. And like I mentioned earlier, the JPEG that comes out of the Ricoh GR3X or the Ricoh GR3, I'm pretty sure it's phenomenal. I usually don't have to do too much tweaks inside the cameras, and most of the time they look great straight out of the camera. I only find myself going back to the raw files whenever I need, say, more dynamic range, where I need to like pull down the highlights and adjust the shadows. But oftentimes, the more I get it right in camera, the less I have to do, the less I have to deal with. And so far, I really like the color inside this camera. It's amazing. And honestly, as long as you expose your photo correctly, there's really not much you have to do. And plus, if you want to share these photos on social media, it's gonna be compressed anyways. No one would ever know. Now, personally, I find it very intriguing how a camera can change the way I shoot, the way I develop my photos. Like, I feel like that's a huge change from just shooting raw and then going to like a raw and JPEG. Who knows, maybe one day the technology will be so good to the point where I only shoot JPEG. But I still find it fascinating how changing gear, using different kind of camera gear can change the way you shoot. Anyways, I'm gonna head out and enjoy playing with my Ricoh. If you like the Ricoh as much as I do, maybe check out this video next. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.